What's going on, fans of Philly? Zach Chavalella here with the Still Processing the 76ers podcast crew. On today's show, we're going to be talking about the latest rumors involving one, LeBron James, two, Philadelphia, and break down Jake Fischer's recent report for Yahoo Sports on some of the Sixers' recent targets and also just their mentality heading into the offseason. All that and more on today's episode of Still Processing, the 76ers podcast. Welcome back. Thank you for joining us. Joined, of course, by Sam D. Giovanni, Justin Crosby. Gentlemen, how are we doing this fine night?
We are doing good. Excited to be back. Slower times on the Sixers slop landscape right now, but still some stuff going on, and I'm excited to chop it up with you guys.
Yeah, kind of feels like people are kind of throwing slop at the wall to see what sticks. It's kind of like my grandmother, may the Lord rest her soul. Justin, how are you feeling in this offseason, man? What are you feeling with these rumors swirling around?
I'm just something new every day, or the same thing every day. How about that? But yeah, just interested to see, how the off season takes shape, and it's like I said, it's a little slowed up right now. But I think immediately after the NBA Finals, you will start heating up.
Yeah, I mean that's the hope, and I know that can't come soon enough for Sixers fans. Definitely not the easiest thing watching Boston, effectively skip their way to the finals. I think knowing that Philly could have put up a solid fight, but of course you don't get out of the first round, you can't get to the final dance. Got to move on, and so that's what all of Philadelphia has done, and that's why we've been talking about star hunting for. It feels like a lifetime, but here we are back at it. The latest, greatest star connected to the Philadelphia 76ers. Guy has been brought up at times throughout the offseason. But that, of course, is one LeBron James. So Brian Windhorst, ESPN's Brian Windhorst, joined the Get Up crew earlier this morning, kind of gave a bit of an update on the LeBron James situation. And, before we delve into kind of our opinions and our takes on the whole situation, why don't we take a look into what exactly Windy had to say and, see what type of update this really is. Is this something substantial, or is this more so ESPN talking about LeBron because that's what ESPN does? But I'll let Wendy take it from here.
I think when you look at the options, I think the Lakers are still in very, very strong position. I would be surprised if he's not a Laker. But it is fair to point out that Daryl Morey has been trying to sign LeBron for a decade now, multiple different opportunities. And of the teams that have a chance to win the championship next year, the only team with cap space that could offer LeBron a max contract is the 76ers. Other teams could do sign-in trades, but the Lakers wouldn't have to cooperate. The 76ers are a threat. I don't think they're a serious threat, but certainly in the NBA, you never rule anything out.
Yeah, so the headline everyone ran with, right, was that the Sixers are a threat to, or I shouldn't say everyone, most everyone ran with, your Bleacher Reports, your Legion Hoops, NBA Central, or all these other aggregate sites, that's what they ran with. The Sixers are a threat to sign LeBron James. Did it really sound like the Sixers are a threat to sign LeBron James based on what Wendy said? I mean, Sam, like, what part of maybe I don't know, maybe perhaps when he said that they're not really a serious threat, where did you land on this by the time Wendy was done?
Those are kind of the words that I was hanging on, like serious threat, because if like the only truly really good team that can easily open up cap space isn't a serious threat, then like no other team really is. Like I think at this point it's probably just tough to like see what's going to happen, see what way LeBron is leaning. I'm sure whatever happens in the draft with Bronny is going to influence him in some way. But yeah, there was nothing definitive about that. And there's probably not going to be anything super definitive for a while, which it just always feels like that's it feels like we're almost like, I mean, obviously all you need is LeBron James and the Sixers to throw out a tweet or do what you need to get that engagement. But it just feels like genuinely we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, or at least some people are just trying to like drum up more interest instead of the actual like games that are going on. Because I mean, they're just getting down there with obviously comes at the end of the season. But yeah, nothing that stood out to me incredibly. Like, yeah, the Sixers are a good team. They have the cap space to sign LeBron, and if LeBron decides to leave the team he's been with for the past, I guess, half decade now, it's kind of crazy to say he's going to go to that team, which he has been took a meeting with previously. So nothing super shocking.
Yeah, Justin, gut check on you. Where do you feel that LeBron ends up after his little flirtatious visit with free agency this summer?
LA. I mean, yeah, LeBron he's been the captain, for the last, I don't know, 10 plus year captain of, being able to control his own fate and be able to make a move at a dime's notice. That's all this is. This is just, saying that, okay, he can opt out, which he probably will in general to get more money in the long term. But outside of that, this is just talk. Yeah, would it be nice if he came to the Sixers? Absolutely. But ultimately, this is just, something to keep, everybody talking, something to pull some leverage from the Lakers side. One specifically, in my opinion, is because the draft is before free agency. So I think LeBron is fully, like full-fledged, putting pressure on the Lakers to make a move on draft night for whoever it is, Trae Young, DeJounte Murray, whoever that they think can help him and AD out before he decides what he needs to do. So I'm sure he'll opt out in general, right? He'll opt out in general, but I think that ultimately, he'll be in LA. So this is just a pressure cooker to press the Lakers on the roster side and on the coach side to sign whoever they want him to sign as his podcast mate.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of just sounds like they're just talking, and you talked about the making additions to the team. You talked about Bronny. I mean, listen. We've heard the rumors out there that he's not been a part of the coaching hire, that he hasn't spoken to JJ Redick about the head coaching job, which like I defy you to prove that they have not talked about that. Be shocking for two podcast co-hosts to like, Sam, if I was about to coach your team, like we would have talked about that at some point. Like that's just not how that works. So whatever those
other
reports
people
like,
in mind, that's why.
all right. Well, that's why I need you to kind of do a little bit of the legwork here, like LeBron is. Okay, so to get me into that spot, I'm trying to get in that JJ Redick Lakers role here. So, when you look at that, and I kind of broke this down in an article on PSN earlier today, like it's a bargaining chip. That's what all this is in free agency. That's what all this talk is. People are using other teams for leverage, right? So whether it is LeBron James, or clutch points, to I guess be more accurate. Leverage clutch points,
buddy.
Because I'm talking to Sam.
Yeah, I made that joke. That's why I threw it out there. But yeah, clutch sports.
So if it's Rich Paul, Adele's boyfriend, who is kind of trying to get all this talk going, or whether it is Paul George, talking about how Philadelphia's will possibly sign him to a max, try to incentivize the Clippers. Jimmy Butler, who, is threatening possibly going elsewhere if he doesn't get his money. Like at the end of the day, LeBron wants to be with the Lakers. Paul George wants to be with the Clippers, and Jimmy Butler wants to be with the Heat. Now, are these guys willing to go elsewhere to get, what they really want, which, in the case of Paul George and Jimmy Butler's that bag? Yeah, I think that they are. The difference with LeBron James is that he's not chasing the bag. He's not chasing the ring. He set up an entire, or even if, he's not chasing the NBA bag, I should say, because he has a whole empire out there in LA. I mean, the dude's straight la la land, and he's doing great in it. Like, respect to him for that. But he's in a place where he is set up not only for, his present, but also his future in LA. So if you can, on top of that, Make sure that your team, who you love playing for a team with that rich history, you love playing on the West Coast, specifically in LA. You have AD right there with you. You think you can figure out a way to get your son a job there. You think that you can get some, either some other players, whether it's a DeMar DeRozan, or if you're talking about making a trade for one of those guys, Trae Young, DeJounte Murray, like Justin mentioned, like you have all these possibilities. Like, yeah, you want that in LA, but you will make damn sure that they understand that you have options, that you are LeBron James and you can go elsewhere. It doesn't mean that you will, but that you can go elsewhere. So now that we've effectively knocked out the fact that we all think that LeBron James is not coming to Philadelphia, and there's effectively no shot at that, that's a perfect time to talk about whether LeBron James should come to Philadelphia. So, Justin, how would you feel about LeBron coming to Philly? Do you think that's a fit that you would benefit the Sixers? Is he a guy who's kind of near the top of your list? Let's talk pure talent. Let's talk pure fit. And then obviously we can fit in things like age and money and all that. But how would you feel about that fit?
I mean, I feel like it's a no-brainer. Like, LeBron James, arguably the best player to ever play the game. He is 40. Was still, I think it's 20 straight years of being on all NBA team. What he averaged 26, 7 and 6 last year or something like that. Could still to be the hub
40% from three.
Shoot, yeah, a hub could still be the hub of an offense. So like, it's a no-brainer. The fit, you can talk about needing a high volume shooter next to Joel, but that's what, in this scenario, that's what you have Maxey for. LeBron's not going to shoot 10 threes a game. But he will take his fair share off the dribble, maybe not necessarily off the catch, but then when you talk about times where Tyrese Maxey can be off the ball, or the offense is struggling going through Joel or Tyrese, you will still have LeBron. Playmaking still off the chart. Athleticism for a 40-year-old, it's amazing. Rebounding, amazing. So ultimately, it will be a great fit. They will just have to find the pieces around to fit, which will probably be like 2, 3-and-D shooters. But outside of that, I think it would be a great fit. And it should be a no-brainer if it was a real opportunity.
Yeah. Sam, how are we feeling about LeBron to Philly?
To illustrate how good it could look, think back to how good the Sixers were with James Harden. Bear with me for just a second. Like, having that centered pick and roll with Harden and Embiid, it was an easy go-to play because both guys were so good, and it felt like they got good shots just about every single time. And they had Tyrese Maxey on the wing, providing not only a great shooting threat but a great off the catch driving threat. Like, it felt, he's obviously one of the quickest guys in the league, and giving him the chance to attack closeouts just makes it even more unfair. So now imagine that, but with LeBron instead of Harden, who, even at his age, LeBron is bigger and a better playmaker. I think he's just more built to like keep going downhill and putting pressure on the defense than Harden is. Even if he doesn't have a signature, step back type of counter, like, he's still really freaking good in a lot of ways. Think now that Tyrese Maxey is even better, and think now that this is all going down under a better and more creative coach in Nick Nurse compared to Doc Rivers. Like, I don't think there's going to be a better fit for the Sixers as opposed to like what stars can become available than LeBron, at least among the names that like we can kind of assume are going to be up for grabs. Like, forget how old he is. Forget that you're going to throw him a big bag for a few years for his like possibly last few years in the league. He is exactly what they need. They need playmaking to unlock Embiid and Maxey just as much as they need to unlock the other guys around them. It would obviously behoove them to add a wing aside their guard and center, obviously. If LeBron's shooting improvement is real, maybe it's not 41% from three, but it's, still 38%. Like, he's not exactly a floor spacer because he's a great, great shooter, although he was last year. But God's not going to give him like the Ben Simmons or the Giannis treatment because you're not going to give him all that space to attack downhill. Like, yeah, LeBron coming to Philly is something we're all going to have to see before we believe it, and probably have to see and let it register for a few days should it even happen before we actually all believe it. But it's not something to think too much about. Like having LeBron, even at his age, he's still a great player, and especially because he would have 2 younger co-stars to lean on. I think the fit would be outstanding.
Yeah, I mean the fit I think would be great. I don't know that it's the best fit of all the options, but I think he's the best player of all the options. So it's the best option in my mind, right? So I think that Paul George, in theory, is a cleaner option just because he's that generic baseline 3-and-D wing. Obviously, the D has taken a huge downtick from where it's been in past years. LeBron, when he's engaged, is a much better defender. Now, you're not getting that defender in the regular season, but LeBron, when he's engaged, is a much better defender than Paul George right now. But just from a guy who, has the ability to facilitate a little bit, a guy who is kind of a volume knockdown shooter, that's more Paul George's game. On the fit side, that's where I side with Paul George. Do not get it twisted, though. LeBron James, at this point, is a much better player than Paul George right now. So, from that perspective and the fact that he is still a very good fit in Philadelphia, I think when you consider everything, like even the age, even the contract that you'd have to sign him to, considering that you're not giving up assets to get him, because you get, again, you're not trading anything to get him, you're just signing him outright, theoretically. Like, you're talking about the best possible situation, even arguably, I would say, over a guy like Donovan Mitchell, just again, because we get back to that fit area, which, you're talking about fit and you're talking about, Justin, you got to behave in this private chat. We're talking about, fit, and we're talking about, how we get these guys to perform in the playoffs as well, right? And even though you are looking at a guy like Donovan Mitchell, who's a great playoff performer, LeBron is a different playoff guy. Like that's just it. We've seen him. He made All NBA team, in this past regular season, and he's like taking off like every other game, basically. Like not sitting, but he's being passive, right? So, we've seen LeBron when he's engaged. We've seen the difference that it makes, and it's a whole different level of a player than Philadelphia has seen, really since Allen Iverson, at least consistently. So, on that front, I do think that, LeBron is certainly a worthy target to go after. And Brian Windhorst even talks about Daryl Morey and his tendency to go after big names like this. And so I fully expect Daryl to have that conversation, to try and reach out to LeBron's representation and see if they can finally, at long last, get a meeting between Philadelphia and LeBron James. We'll see what happens.
I mean, he
there.
called the Lakers at the deadline. So
yeah, exactly. That's what I'm saying. Like, he's made these calls. Like, he called on LeBron. I think he called on Durant and Booker too. If I'm remembering the names
Durant,
right.
Yeah, not Booker, but Durant.
Like, Daryl Morey does not give a shit. Basically, like, he doesn't care. Like, he wants good players. Like, that. Quite literally, the worst they can say is no. So if it's like a situation where, like, you were looking to add the best talent, obviously, and Daryl Morey specifically is a huge proponent of adding the best players makes the best teams. So yes, he's going to call about the Kevin Durant's. He's going to call about the LeBron James, the Paul George, the Donovan Mitchells. He's probably going to make a call about Brandon Ingram. Even though I know he's a controversial kind of figure when you talk about that like star tier, but any one of these players, like, expect Daryl Morey to make a call on. So conversely, like, when you hear those rumors that, Daryl Morey, he called about, Trae Young, like, don't be surprised when you hear it, because, like, of course he's going to call about them, because that's just called due diligence. So, not even saying it as a compliment to Morey, just more so stating it as a fact. That's just his game. That's his style. So I think that there's going to be conversation around LeBron, but LeBron is in LA as far as I'm concerned. So, with that, we turn from LeBron to some of the other potential targets for Philadelphia, and courtesy of Yahoo Sports, Jake Fischer, friend of the pod, Jake Fischer, we have a heaping article of slop, Sixers specific slop, mind you, that came out this past Thursday. Now, it's not the most, detailed in the sense of, they're increasing negotiations with Chicago, blah, blah, blah. Nothing like that. But more so, we have kind of a complete overview almost of the Sixers offseason that covers really everything from the top of the highest end targets for Philadelphia into kind of those backup options, right? So Just kind of go rapid fire on some of these bigger targets because they're guys who we've talked about a little bit, and then I'll slow down for some of these players. Paul George, I feel like we've already kind of talked about. I don't want to say ad nauseum because we're gonna talk about Paul George again. I'm just letting you guys know listening right now. We're not done talking about Paul George. I hate to tell you if you're sick about hearing about it, but this is what offseason potting is all about, and the true sickos are going to love us talking about Paul George and fighting to the death over whether or not Paul George is a better addition versus Donovan Mitchell versus Darius Garland versus Brandon Ingram versus I don't know, the corpse of Al Horford. We're going to go down sinking with that shit. But Paul George, obviously the connection there is obvious. Whether or not it is purely just a matter of trying to get the Clippers to give him a little more money. What is really interesting that he did mention, that Jake did mention, is the extension news regarding Paul George and the Clippers, right? So he mentions how Kawhi's extension came to a 3-year, $153 million agreement. Obviously well below that 4-year max. I think it's at $223 million. So what is necessarily, Paul George's situation? Conversations are happening between George and the Clippers. You just, there's not been a single thought from, or at least that's been expressed to the public that the Clippers are looking to max out George. You're hearing about 3-year offers. You're hearing about lesser dollar amount, value. The one question I do want to ask you guys is based on not just what Jake says here, but just everything that we've heard so far from the Clippers front about the lack of desire to, sign. Not only let's talk about year 4, but on top of that, the extra money. So, with that in mind, the hesitancy from Los Angeles, Sam, I guess we'll start with you. Where is your likelihood meter on the Sixers actually having a chance if they're willing to go for that 4-year max?
I would say they have a pretty good chance. I mean, once again, they're one of the very few teams just with cap space overall for a max spot, but also like the very best one. And I do think that, with how the Clippers have, treated this Paul George contract situation of dragging it out and not being able to agree with him on an extension. I mean, there seems to be a little smoke of like disagreement, and if that becomes a fire that sends Paul George out of his hometown, I think that would be, you know, um, pretty significant. And I think that, like you mentioned earlier, the Sixers are an easy team to use for leverage because of all the optionality they have, all the flexibility. It's easy to make a rumor out about them, about like they might be interested in this player or whatever, to drive up the price of another guy like Paul George. And I mean, I do think it's more like you mentioned with the fit, it's super clean. I do think it's more than just like smoke to try to get LA to pony up and maybe get themselves paying a contract they're not quite comfortable with. I think there's a fit that Paul George has with the Sixers that makes a ton of sense. And, for any concern that you might have about happy to spend owner Steve Ballmer, right? Like for him not to want to pay Paul George the max, you can look at that and be like, ooh, really? If this guy is not like he's super stingy and they're going to have this new arena next year, they obviously want to, show out with their trio of LA homegrown stars. So it is just interesting to like keep an eye on. And I would be surprised honestly if Paul George signs for anywhere below the max contract. I think the big thing will be if it is that, how long the max is, whether it's 3, 4, or 5 years.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree, and I think that's going to be the biggest factor is how close to competing will LA be willing to go. I don't think that can they even go year 5. I think there's a based on Paul George's age, isn't there a limit?
That's a good question. I think
Yeah, I think it's year 4. It's only 4.
Very close.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
4 because
so
I think you can't. I think since he's 34, or what is it? It'll be 34. You can't do it after 30. Like you can't have a contract going past like 38 or something. So
well,
I don't think
whatever
he
the
can get there.
case is, the interesting thing is I know that the Clippers can offer. I want to say it's roughly about $8 million more than Philadelphia. So it may take that full amount as well. It may reach the point where just in negotiation tactics, even if LA comes out and they're like, oh, we'll give you, we'll match Philadelphia's offer. Well, no, that's not good enough. That was the offer 5 minutes ago, but we live in a different world now, to quote Draft Day. That now we're talking about going what is truly, truly the max for the Clippers, not just maxing Philadelphia's deal. So I think it is going to be interesting. I think you're right, Sam. I think there are reasons that George would actually be enticed about coming to play for the Sixers. More so, I think that's about the age and ability of Philadelphia's stars versus Los Angeles' stars, as opposed to it, being a city for city difference. Just with the history of, what LA has meant as a desirable landing spot, and more so than that, you've mentioned it, it's his hometown as well. But Justin, if the Sixers were to offer that full max to Paul George, if he were to accept it, how are we feeling about that? You see that Shams notification come across, that Woj notification come across. How's your gut feeling when that comes up?
I think that you, like, me personally, look at it as a successful offseason already, just because they went after a guy who's a star. They got him to match him maxing and be, I think, fans and also us who are in the building covering the team. I think that there is a thought of perfection, right? We need the perfect guy. We want the perfect guy. And the perfect guy isn't out there. And if you can get Paul George, although he may be older, he's a good fit on the court, and you're still able to hold on to your draft assets to make moves later, I think that's a win-win for me. If you're telling me on July 1st or whatever the date is that they come out, or July 2nd, whatever, they come out and it says they signed Paul George to a max deal, and you're telling me, all right, say they waive Paul Reed and then they wind up having, they can have like $17 million in cap, if they waive Reed or trade him, whatever, plus vet minimums, they could probably make the roster up really well. And on top of that, the room exception as well, which is like another like 8 or 9 million. Like, they can probably go out and really make some headway into a couple guys to help, fill out the roster, starters and other people. And I think it would be a win, and still a lot of flexibility to say, like, if we want, I don't know, just throwing it out there, Nickeil Alexander-Walker, or you want another guy, we got a first-round draft pick to throw at Minnesota to, prime away, or, whoever it may be. Caruso, he's been a person whose name has been long discussed. I think they'll do it. So I think that would be a win. You get to keep your draft capital, and then you figure it out from there.
Yeah, I mean, that's the biggest allure of going after one of these free agents, as opposed to, selling the farm and getting a Donovan Mitchell type, or even a Brandon Ingram, who, I got news for you guys, is going to cost more than fans are expecting, or possibly are even going to want to pay. That's just the price of doing business. If Alex Caruso, and mind you, I will declare this, I think Caruso is a more useful playoff player than Brandon Ingram. But factoring in, surface stats, factoring in age, everything such as that, I think Brandon Ingram's asking price is going to be higher. Caruso's is starting at 2 first-round picks. So if that's the case for Caruso, where do we expect this Brandon Ingram bidding war, which every team's going to be looking for a wing who can score? Where do we expect that to go? And we have, there's other teams out there like Cleveland who can offer a player like Jared Allen, who the Pelicans could certainly use next year, or a better player, even than that, Darius Garland, who the Pelicans may have some interest in. And I don't like that McCollum Garland backcourt, but we're not a Pelicans pod, so we won't really dive too deep into that. But with that being the case, like, you're talking about teams that can offer players. The Orlando Magic, another team that can offer young players and picks. So you're talking about possibly getting into a bidding war for a guy like Brandon Ingram or a guy like Donovan Mitchell, whereas suppose you can bring in Paul George, and yes, there's risk with the age. Yes, there's risk with the injury. Yes, you're paying a lot of money, more so than if you bring in an Ingram or Mitchell or one of those guys. But still, you're not giving up those draft assets, which is going to be absolutely key to filling out the roster, not only in this year, but to in any way that you can also extend this window for Joel Embiid, which at this point is looking pretty narrow. But if you're able to bring in a guy like Paul George, that next 2 years is completely solid. And having that draft capital on top of that can potentially extend that window from there. So definitely all set. If Paul George, I think, is, if you look at the realistic options, which, for me, I would consider him realistic, LeBron not realistic, and, we can debate so on and so forth, who is and who's not. But I do believe Paul George is a realistic option, and I think he's solid moving forward. To kind of move through, some of these other names that he mentions, OG Anunoby. Obviously, there's been reports of Anunoby possibly testing free agency, which is something that I don't think that we thought initially was a possibility. It just kind of sounded like, you could count on both Siakam and OG to be re-signing with the teams that they landed with. And Siakam sounds like it's staying in Indiana. They're going to offer him the max contract from the most recent reports. But what happens with OG and Anunoby? So, real quick, Justin, is OG, I think we can all agree, OG a worse player than Paul George, at least, especially offensively. He's a significantly better player defensively, but we would probably put him in a lower tier than Paul George as a player right now. Or if Paul George is getting 50 a year, are you throwing 40 at OG to keep him away from the Knicks? And are you happy about that decision?
I mean, yes, because you save money, he's younger, but I think your expectations of what you would expect from OG as a fan would be different than what you would expect from Paul George as a fan. Like, as far as the performance of what they bring to the team, like, OG's not an isolation scorer. He can get a couple buckets here and there with his drive and forearm shiver and fadeaway, but you would really entrust him to be a 3-and-D guy. And of course, like, all these guys are imperfect, so that's why OG wants to test the market. I mean, the Knicks aren't thinking about, at this point, their reports are saying that they want to offer him $35 million a year. That's not even his max. So there's a reason why he's not getting the max either. But if you weren't able to get Paul George or any of these other options, and again, you can keep your picks and you'll have more cap room. Say you're offering him 38 or 40. I mean, I think he would take that overall. And you're taking somebody away from a division rival, a possible contender in the East, and still, have your draft capital. So, I mean, if all the other options weren't available, I think you do it. They were interested, apparently. All the reporting is saying they were interested in OG early on. They just didn't have the young players to make something happen. So, I think if he's available and all other things fall through, I think they do it. And I think I would do it.
I think that's the thing that people tend to forget, with both OG and Pascal Siakam, is that, in both cases, you had players going back to Toronto, and that was a big sticking point. Toronto clearly values the ability to match any offer on Emmanuel quickly this offseason. They clearly like RJ Barrett, and it's shockingly, because, I think there were plenty of reasons not to like him in New York. He certainly looked a lot better in Toronto so far. So it's tough. Well, we'll see if that holds up, but it's tough to think about the Sixers competing with those types of offers. But Sam, really for you, like, I think we can all agree that OG Anunoby's fit is very solid in Philadelphia. Very strong defender, very capable shooter from the perimeter. But to kind of pose the same question as to Justin, do you feel comfortable? Would you prefer to go for a younger guy like Anunoby at about 10 million less? Or would you prefer to get that star-proven talent in a guy like Paul George?
I think that OG makes a ton of sense, and I think that the difference in their contracts, if I had to guess, would not be that much. I would assume they're both going to get near max deals, but I think because Paul George has been in the league longer, he's eligible to get more than OG is. The thing with OG that would concern me a lot is the injuries. He gets injured a lot throughout his career. Has never been a guy that's been consistently able to play a lot of games throughout the regular season. And even if stuff just comes up here and there, like as we see with Joel, some guys it's just more likely to happen. They're just not as fortunate. And OG is one of those guys, and it's unfortunate because like he really does have game-changing defense. Like, he is such a good defender, one of the absolute best, especially among his position. Offensively, he is way less, like, solid/consistent. He's obviously a really good shooter, but asking him to do anything else aside from maybe, like, cut off the ball is kind of like, you're not you might get a result that you might not like a lot of the times. I think he fits super well with. I mean, it would be a great move for the Sixers to get him, if only because they would kind of take away one of the key pieces of a contender in their conference. Even though that would be the risk of OG's injuries would come to them, it would at least leave the Knicks scrambling for options. But I think that if you're gonna make a move for OG, it would make more sense to like make sure he's not the third scoring option. Like as much as he, wants to have his time with the ball, he's not a guy that you should expect to go for like consistent creation. So I think it might, make sense. I don't know if this would work money wise with what these guys are projected to make, but if you're going to go for OG, it makes sense to bring another guy like Malik Monk, who can, even if he comes off the bench, provide some sort of balance with someone else who can kind of create the offense, while OG is used mainly as a spot up guy or someone who's attacking, kind of like deeper into the plays, deeper into the possession. So again, but for me with OG, it comes back to the injuries. For as great as he is, I think whatever team pays him the big bucks that he, in fairness, does deserve, is going to be continually wary about how many games you're going to get out of him.
Yeah, so Knicks had 41 games that they played after acquiring OG Anunoby. He played in 17 of them last season, and that is not a one-time trend. Obviously, his time in Toronto, we've seen injury as well. Again, though, not that Paul George is not susceptible to missing games of his own. He's missed quite a few over the past few years, and even had to miss the postseason as well. Not this past year, but just in years previous with LA. So I think it's definitely a concern. I at times have advocated for going the role player route, and the more that I look specifically at Paul George's fit and thinking about how close that money might be, as you alluded to, Sam, between Paul George and an OG Anunoby, I get the idea of possibly bringing in OG and Malik Monk. That's going to be really difficult if OG is much further north than $40 million. But they're two guys that I like. I'm not going to say I don't like. Like I like both of them potentially for Philadelphia, and I think that they both separately solve plenty of needs for the Sixers. I would say more so my concern is having a guy that is proven of producing offensively come the postseason, right? And for all the guff that Paul George gets, and sometimes rightfully so, he's been a much better playoff player than a lot of people would have you believe. So, all the pandemic P and all that, like, there really was a time where there was a playoff P, and even in more recent history, like I get that he had, an unimpressive outing here, an unimpressive outing there. But I think there's a temptation to associate it with James Harden's appearance, when he was here in Philadelphia, and then we saw the explosive games, and then we saw the not quite goose eggs, but just the lay flat games. The difference I think there is that you're looking at a completely different player mentally, right? And so I don't necessarily say that Paul George is going to be the perfect player come the playoffs for Philadelphia. And as we, Justin pointed out, like that player does not necessarily, it doesn't exist, right? You're not going to be able just to pick the perfect player for Philadelphia. Jason Tatum's not walking through that door. Anthony Edwards is not walking through that door. Like these guys who could solve huge needs for Philadelphia, like there's a reason that certain guys are available and that certain guys are not. But, with that being said, I do have more faith in kind of putting, my eggs in the basket of a guy who's been there a lot more than some of these other guys. And, as much as I'm worried about the injury history of Paul George, I'm a little less concerned about George than I am OG Anunoby. And that's kind of a scary thought, when you're thinking about that. And, if you're talking about the worst case scenario, you're talking about signing OG, up to a max deal, which for him is it's a 4-year deal, and it's over like $150 million for $181 million actually. is the max deal for OG Anunoby. And, you know, if you're talking about a guy who could theoretically average less than 60 games a year on that deal, that's kind of a scary thought, you know, when you're talking about working with, you know, what left of the window you have for Joel Embiid and entering the prime of Tyrese Maxey. So, you know, for me, I don't hate the idea. I could very easily be talked into it. I would much rather do something like that than go out and trade for like a John Collins, you know, and just eat up in the cap space for a guy and, you know, I guess we'll get to this sooner than expected. Trading for a guy like a Zach LaVine, which Jake Fischer also discussed in his latest article, or rather in this specific article. The context of which Jake mentions is if Philadelphia receives additional assets for. But for me, just having a guy at that salary number who's that unreliable, you know, with the injuries, he's that unreliable as a locker room guy. I get that there's the attractive scoring talent, but just at that price, with the history, with the age, you know, athletic players, once they creep near 30, which he's still under 30, but he's got the mileage in terms of years. Those are all concerns for me. So, well, whether we're talking about Paul George, OG Anunoby, Zach LaVine, obviously these are concerns that are shared through all of them. But I guess if I'm ranking, you know, who would rather have, for me, it's Paul George, OG, Zach LaVine. But we're not going to spend too much time on Zach LaVine just because it's probably something that we could do in a lot more depth. But I just want to talk about the idea that Jake lays out about Philadelphia considering him if Chicago would be willing to attach draft capital. All I want, and I guess, Sam, we'll start with you. Do you think Chicago is that desperate at this point that they're willing to attach draft capital to Zach LaVine?
I think they are not going to. I think they still value LaVine a lot, and they're not going to go that way. And honestly, like, I kind of get it. Like, they're a very tough front office to read. I mean, they're easy to read in that they like this group they have more than their own families, and they're not going to break it up over anything. And it's very stupid. They should not have that. But I think it's, you know, I guess just for a rebuilding team, like when you have a guy like LaVine, it's probably best to let him get some value up as opposed to like shedding that contract immediately, because they're also not like they don't have a super high payroll. So like shedding his, you know, contract, sure you don't have to pay it, but then, you know, what are you going to get? Like, what's the possible benefit you could get if you're a bad team like Chicago? So I remain somewhat optimistic that if he gets back to the player he was before this season, LaVine could be pretty good with the Sixers or another good team. But as per Fisher's framing of, you know, a guy with a negative contract that would require assets to take on, I don't think the Bulls are ever going to get to that point.
Yeah, that's a much more positive outlook on Zach LaVine than myself personally. Justin, how are we feeling about the idea of Zach LaVine? And I do agree with Sam in the sense that I don't think Chicago's ready to attach assets to move off of him. I think in their mind, they're still expecting assets for him. And I think there's still teams that would be willing to do so. But what's your feeling on that there?
So I disagree. So I was against the whole Zach LaVine thing for a while, and I was like, oh no, like contract's bad, he doesn't play defense. But then like the more and more I thought about it and I looked at it, and I'm like, change of scenery, playing for a different coach with emphasis on defense. Maybe he can really use his athleticism and tools to be passable on defense. I'm not saying a lockdown defensive wing, but passable. But then I looked at his contract and I'm like, all right, next year 43 million, the following year 45 million, player option for 48 million. That's a lot of money. But when you look at it and you talk about like offensive options and a third guy, I think like outside of Paul George, and of course we'll talk about some others, but LaVine definitely outweighs OG in that aspect. And I think that if they could get an asset or a first round pick with him to take on his contract, because at the end of the day, right, who knows what Chicago's going to do, and if like who knows what they're going to do. And you know, there's rumors of if things don't, work out, or PG, I don't know what if PG goes to Orlando. I'm just making this up, but like DeMar DeRozan might try to go to LA, or he may try to go somewhere else. So who knows if they try to blow it up or whatever. So I do think that they've been trying to force feed a Zach LaVine trade because he just does not want to be there anymore. And if they have to pay to get off of him, and if it's one late first or something like that, I think they would do it. And in my eyes, I feel like there's always a secondary plan, or like a third plan in the wing with Daryl Morey. If we do this, if they do this, we do that. If we have this, we can do this. And I think ultimately, he would think about something like that, especially if they would get draft capital. But we'll see.
I want to add to that point about real quick. I want to add to the point about using Zach LaVine's physical tools to make him into a passable defender. That happened 2 seasons ago. The Bulls were 5th, I believe, in defensive rating for that season. And they obviously had Caruso. They picked up Patrick Beverley halfway through, and those guys were probably, pulling more of the weight, Caruso especially. But you look at that team, there were not that many great defenders. And the Bulls used LaVine not as their, their stopper guy, but as a guy who contributed using his athleticism, using, being in the right position, making the right rotations, and contesting shots as best as he could. He wasn't, to my knowledge, wasn't a guy who was flying around the court and making crazy blocks, crazy plays like that. But the concept that you were talking about, Justin, has played out not all that long ago. And for a team like the Sixers, you think of like what they did last year. Nico Batum was their primary perimeter defender, and they obviously had a guy in Melton who has a better better defensive game, more of that reputation than LaVine does. But LaVine is a little bigger and he's more athletic, and part of that might be because D'Anthony's unfortunately dealing with those back injuries. We'll see. Obviously, hopefully, they do not continue to be a problem. But if you have LaVine as your backcourt mate with Maxey, or another team out there that might want to pair him with like a score first type of guard, I think that there is a potential to make that work defensively if LaVine is willing to buy in. It does require him to buy in, but it happened not too long ago where he was playing a key role on a good defensive team. So it's not as like this crazy notion that like you would have to like see that play out for the first time. It did play out previously.
What are you doing to me, Sam? But are you going to make me do this right now? We were having a nice time. We were having a nice time. We were getting ready to move on to Jimmy Butler and the Keith Pompey report. And now you brought up this idea, this notion, this fantasy that Zach LaVine could be a serviceable defender. Let's look back at that Chicago Bulls team, right? So obviously they're playing at that time under Billy Donovan. Billy Donovan did a great job instilling a solid defense with that entire unit. When we look at the roster, obviously DeMar DeRozan, Nikola Vucevic, they're not really instilling much, I guess the word would be, much faith, when you talk about their ability defensively. But you look at some of these other guys, Patrick Williams, obviously Patrick Beverley, you mentioned, was a huge addition for them, and that helped transform the defense. You look at a guy like Ayo Dosunmu, who played a huge role. Alex Caruso played a huge role. Javonte Green, huge role. Derrick Jones Jr., Andre Drummond. Like, I got to push back on the defender thing, because I think that, you had a wealth of defenders on that team. And yeah, maybe you had LaVine playing a bit more man than he's typically used to. But I completely disagree with the fact that he was one of the top defenders on that team, because for that, it was entirely up to the village at that point. And for a guy like Zach LaVine, who at really no point in his career has ever like truly bought in to a coach, like has never really showed a desire to play defense. I have no faith that he would get along with a guy like Nick Nurse. And I have no faith that he would, be able to utilize that athleticism, or desire to utilize that athleticism to the point where it would benefit the defense. And furthermore, again, we're talking about a guy who's had a lot of lower body injuries, and not only just lower body injuries, but this most recent foot injury it's not an original injury. Like this is a foot injury he's had previously that he did not get surgery on in the past, that continue to just cause, suffering for him. He got the surgery now. Maybe it's fixed, maybe it's not. But you're talking about a guy who's had a lot of lower body injuries before age 30. He's played for Tom Thibodeau, and we all know how that kills players' legs. Just ask OG Anunoby. Like, this is a guy who I don't feel great about his long-term outlook athletically. He relies on that a lot. The shot's going to age well. I have no faith there. I think he's a guy who's going to be serviceable until his later years, kind of like a Klay Thompson almost in that sense. Defensively, though, I think it's an absolute nightmare. That's my rant. Take all the time you want to rebuttal, but I had to get that out.
The injury stuff is fair. If you are projecting him to not be sustainable playing heavy minutes and that he's going to deal with those lower body injuries, especially for a high flyer like him, that I understand. But I think he did buy into that Billy Donovan team. And maybe I was propping him up more than I was sounding. I wasn't trying to make him out to be like the key contributor on that defense.
You called him Gary Payton, the second coming, if I recall. Were those your words?
And I meant it. No, but look, you are correct that team had the makeup of a good defensive squad because they had a lot of good defenders. The point that I was trying to make was that LaVine played his part, and then I think he could do the same if his body holds up.
That is fair
For the Sixers. That's what I was trying to get at. It's not that
just like
you're not throwing him on a team and he's like taking over as the defensive identity. Like he can fit in as like a defensive role player is what I was trying to get at. And
well,
again,
what was unique about that Bill? What was unique about the Billy Donovan defense is, that it almost had, well, I mean, we talk about like point of attack defense, obviously, right? But you had a squad that was assembled to the point where, you had a guy who, as long as he has lateral quickness, like Zach LaVine does, your team defense won't necessarily suffer because you have guys who can rotate off ball quick enough that, or rotate on ball even, to the point where they can help and they can help cover the weakness of whatever defender you have at that point. So again, it was a solid defensive scheme. He technically played in the defense. So, he did do his part, but I just don't think that, I think that his part was not necessarily like the token, not necessarily like the, placeholder, the placebo, whatever you have, but it I think was far from the most important role in the defense. But then again, a change of scenery does a lot for a guy. He's clearly unhappy in Chicago. Maybe he's just grateful for the opportunity to actually compete with Philadelphia, which is something that he hasn't had a chance to enjoy that often in his career. Justin, did you have something to add before we move on to Jimmy Butler? It seemed like
no. We can move on.
Okay,
you blew up.
I'm a little passionate about this one, right?
I love the theory.
I love the theory of Zach LaVine, and we're namesakes, so like I want to support him on that front. On the other hand, there's just way too many, like it's just thing after thing with this guy. And if it's not the injury history, if it's not the not giving a shit about defense, if it's not the contract, which is again an albatross, let's not get that twisted. Like I understand why some people would love to convince themselves into it working. I just don't see it happening. But another guy that people love to see themselves, to convince themselves that this situation would work is Jimmy Butler coming back to Philadelphia, right? Obviously, Jimmy Butler, one of the great all-time one-and-done Sixers. We all remember that fateful season against Nick Nurse's Toronto Raptors. And, of course, Kawhi Leonard, the quadruple bounce, all that good stuff. The latest report on Jimmy Butler, which he's already been connected to the Sixers a couple times throughout the season. Latest report comes from Keith Pompey, who mentions that the Sixers would be willing to extend Jimmy Butler should they acquire him in a trade, right? So it seems like we're already getting ahead of ourselves, but I feel like we all already know why we're getting ahead of ourselves, right? The entire precipice of Jimmy Butler asking out of Miami, which more than likely that's what it would take to get him out of Miami, is based on the fact that he wants to get paid, right? He wants that extension. He's made that perfectly clear to the Miami Heat. I can understand any potential hesitancy they may or may not be feeling about extending Jimmy Butler at this current moment, and it's not about the injury in the postseason. He should be fine after that, but he's about to enter his age 35 season. He's a player who, for the most part of his career, has not relied on his jump shot and has relied, more so on athleticism and admittedly grit, which, grit doesn't die, just as Pat Bev. But that being the case, how are we feeling about trading assets for Jimmy Butler and then extending him? It's kind of the worst of both worlds when you talk about trading for a guy like Donovan Mitchell, although it would theoretically cost less. But then you're extending him and paying him effectively what you would a guy like LeBron James or Paul George. Sam, how does that? Do you think that's something that's worth it? And do you think that Jimmy would be a good enough fit to make that worthwhile?
Every time I think about his fit with the Sixers, I kind of talk myself into it a little bit more and more. The obvious thing is that he's not a big 3-point shooter. That was a problem here, and that has only continued to be the case more and more with Miami. Part of that is because he's so dominant on the ball and whatnot. But still, we know he's not going to turn into a great perimeter shooter. Now, again, he's not someone that guys are going to continue to leave open, and he is a guy that I feel like might be prone to making those hustle plays, getting into the paint, getting offensive rebounds, cutting into open space, that kind of thing. So he could provide that value elsewhere off the ball. On the ball, I like his, having another ball handler out there, a really solid playmaker who, we'll see how much downhill pressure he can put on defenses now with his continually aging legs, but he's really good at that and finding open players. Like I threw it back to how it was in the past with Embiid as the roll man, Maxey off the wing, and a solid ball handler, playmaker, kind of making the offense work. I think Jimmy could work really well, especially with two great scorers helping him out, helping him age, slowly. Defensively, he's at least still very smart, still very strong. Even if he's not going to be the mainstay and perimeter defender, like he can help out in a variety of ways. But every time even if I'm slightly uphill about how I think he could look with him and Joel, who he still has a good relationship with, I always come back to the point of the Sixers would have to trade for him. And a great player is going to cost them something. It's going to cost them cap space no matter what. But having it also cost the draft picks to make trades around the roster, to me, just doesn't justify a fit as questionable as Jimmy. Even though I laid out a bunch of good things, there's still things that could go wrong. Namely, he's another guy who his injury history is kind of scary. So for a great player to cost $40 million a year is one thing. For it to cost for the contract to cost $40 million a year, and to obtain it, the Sixers would have to give up a bunch of draft picks, especially because the Heat value Jimmy a lot. They're not going to let him go easily. This to me is one that I think I mentioned on my last pod appearance 2 weeks ago that it's probably best if the Sixers go to other avenues.
Yeah, I mean, really, it's very tough to envision a scenario where Miami trades Jimmy Butler to Philadelphia for, what would be, I guess described as palatable compensation, right? So for me, I don't really think more than 2 first-round picks and maybe some, whether it's a swap or second-round picks, whatever, to fill it out from there. But the point is, I'm not necessarily willing to go 3 first-round picks if I'm the Philadelphia 76ers. That's my thing first and foremost. I think you laid out a lot of the good pros and cons. He's a very helpful player. The age is a concern. I don't want to be that guy who's like the attitude is a concern, because I think they worried about that too much in the first place. And that's how we got in this situation. That being said, it's not as if it's not a factor, right? So you have to consider it a little bit. And that's, again, part of the reason why this is even being talked about in the first place, is because he's dissatisfied that he's not making the money he wants, and he's making noise about it, even though he's got 2 more years on his deal. Really, he's got a player option next year that he could always decline and then sign outright with the team, right? So he has options, but he wants to secure that bag. I get it. That's his right as an NBA player. But just between the lack of shooting, the age, there's stuff to like about it again, but just 3 first-round picks, possibly 4, like that's you're getting out of range for me, basically, if you're talking about Jimmy Butler. Justin, how do you feel about Jimmy? How do you feel about bringing him back to Philly?
Yeah, I'm like you. Like I agree. 2 first-round picks is the max. Like you can't go more than that. Um, that's just my opinion. Like it would. I don't know if you're telling me it cost 3 or maybe 4 for Mikal Bridges, 5 for and I'm including like swaps too. 5 for Donovan Mitchell. Like 2 seems to fit Jimmy, with his age and everything like that. But the one thing, like everybody has an age thing, like Paul George, whatever the case may be, but LeBron, if you think about LeBron, but the thing with Jimmy that bothers me, I mean, I wouldn't mind it. The fit is murky. We all talked about, both of you guys talked about that, but Pat Riley seems to have this thing where like it gets to a certain point, he knows when it's the right time to kind of let the star go. He even did it with Dwayne Wade when Dwayne Wade wanted money, and he's the best player in franchise history. So, like in my eyes, I'm like, if he's ready to let him go, like that tells me that Riley, it remains to be seen that he'll actually get traded. But it goes to show me that Riley's like, okay, I can't pay a 37-year-old this type of money. Like it just doesn't feel right. And I'd rather build around Bam or, kind of restart from there. So that's the interesting part that's a little weary if they do trade him is the fact that Riley will actually go through it. It makes me think that he's been good on those type of moves with his players. So that would make me a little weary, but I'm sure Joel would love him back.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't. If Pat Riley is, amenable to the idea of trading Jimmy to Philly, something's clearly up. And, if he's not, which I think is much more likely the solution, like the actuality, I mean, even if Jimmy does demand a trade, I would imagine that Pat Riley would love nothing more than to trade him, not only not to the team that he's demanding a trade to, but also just not to another Eastern Conference contender. Like that, like there's just not the logic that makes sense there. It's not like the situation when Jimmy signed with Miami in that sign and trade initially because Jimmy was able to make that decision on his own effectively, and Philadelphia knew that they were going to be losing him, and it was, well, do we lose him for nothing or do we lose him for Josh Richardson? It's not that same kind of situation. So for Miami, the only way that I think that this really works out is if they find a way to add another star through this, right? So looking at their draft picks, they have I believe it's going to be like 2 first-round picks that they can trade, a fair amount of swaps, but I think it's only 29 and and then they'll be able to trade the player from this year. So the player from this year, 29, and then 31, effectively 3 first-round picks at that point. You add a couple more to the arsenal, and now we start talking about Donovan Mitchell, or a player at that level. So if it enables them to land one of those guys, then yes, I think the conversation might change a little bit. But someone, I can't remember who it was, alluded to earlier in the offseason the idea of if this is going to work, it's going to have to be a 3-team trade. And I think that's very much the case. So it's not the most likely outcome. I'm not surprised that Philadelphia is leaking that, assuming that's Keith's source, he said tongue in cheek. But, if that's the case, like, I'm not surprised that information is getting out because that's more fuel to, hey, Jimmy, try and force your way to Philly. Conversely, it's also more fuel, from Jimmy's camp to Miami saying, hey, Miami, pay up because Philly's willing to. So again, anytime anything like this leaks, there's a reason for it. Somebody wants it out there for some reason. And that doesn't mean that it's not true, but it just means that it's out there for a reason. Obviously, we went through a lot today, but just to kind of wrap up, put this on a bow, there's a whole lot that is still expected to happen this offseason. More so just something I want to get kind of a yes or no answer from each of you guys. The last thing that Jake Fischer mentions in the article is the idea of signing veterans on a balloon contract, something kind of similar to what Indiana did with Bruce Brown as the example Fischer gives, signing a guy like Klay Thompson, Kentavious Caldwell-Pope? I just want a yes or no. I'll keep it easy on you guys. Sam, are you interested on if they miss out on a Paul George, on a LeBron James, on an OG and an Obi? Are you interested in signing guys to balloon deals for next year?
In the most reluctant way, yes. First of all, I think Fischer was kind of spitballing names, not to focus too much on Klay Thompson. I cannot imagine
Agreed.
that happening unless the Warriors are offering him like the minimum. Like he's not going to just leave somewhere he's been his whole career to take a balloon payment unless it's way more than he could make and that he believes he's going to, stick it out with the Sixers. But I do think that what Fischer essentially, pushing the gap year as it was called another year. I think it's just a very tough look overall. Like you don't have that many chances to build around Joel. Like even as good as he is and will continue to be, and Maxey will continue to get better. It's like how much doing it one season was a lot. How much further can you really keep it going? But at the end of the day, I do think that doing that, especially if it's for a guy like KCP, who he's been a more of a role player throughout his career, he's been more of a journeyman. I think he'll be more willing to do that, especially because it would be a big chance for him to get a big payday. Whereas again, Klay Thompson's had plenty of those. Like if it's a guy like KCP that fits well, I think it is a sensible idea. It would just be very tough to sell after a whole season of let's be patient. Continuing to be patient would be tougher to sell, but I do think maybe at the end of the day, it would be easier than making a big deal for the sake of making a big deal.
Yeah, no, I well, first and foremost, I fully agree. I think that the important thing here is it has to be the right player, right? Because either way, I do think that
Which is
you
why
are
Bruce
looking
Brown
at that kind of
because he's a guy who could fit. Sorry, but Bruce Brown worked a lot, and so Toronto can keep him for $20 million a year because at worst you're getting a solid rotation guy.
Exactly, and he's the kind of guy that practically fits every team, and that's again the same point with Kentavious Caldwell-Pope. Like it's another guy practically fits every team. So we're talking about these kind of interchangeable veterans, and I'd put he's not on that level, but maybe a guy like a Caleb Martin I think kind of fits in there. Really someone who kind of provides like a little bit of everything. And if you're talking about overpaying for a guy like Malik Monk, I think that's something that they would kind of consider in that camp as well. Because if you're talking about KCP, you're already talking about giving him. He's an option about $15+ million this year with Denver. He's not leaving that unless he's getting say $20 million. So if the balloon talks start at $20 million, it's fair to say that a guy like Malik Monk, maybe you go 25-30 million, and that's your effective balloon contract on a guy who theoretically should be tradable thereafter. But Justin, balloon contracts, where are you feeling on that? Yes or no?
No, like Sam said, no. He reluctantly yes, but I'm a hard no because you get this wrong. I won't say wrong. If this doesn't work out the way you sold Joel, I'm assuming, Maxey at this point, Nick Nurse, the fans, even Daryl said, I need to do this for the fans at his, end of the season presser. This has to be done correctly. Now, I get it. If there's nobody out there, there's nothing you could do. But in my opinion, he's resourceful enough to make something shake. And I think he just absolutely has to. You can't walk into the Wells Fargo with, I don't know, KCP and, name another guy, Obi Toppin and, somebody else, Kelly Oubre, and feel like one, you're a championship contender, and two, that, you're going to get the fan support. And, then you're everybody who signed understands they're on edge kind of the entire season waiting for the trade deadline for a star to shake loose or to hope to shake loose that's a good fit. So, I think the balloon, I'm against that.
Yeah. So the curious thing about it is how much of this is truly a backup plan and how much of this is a potential eventuality that the team's trying to get ahead of, right? So if Paul George returns to the Clippers, LeBron James returns to the Lakers, OG signs with the Knicks, Siakam signs with the Pacers, DeMar goes back to Chicago. You can't trade for Mitchell. You can't trade for Ingram. You can't trade for Jimmy Butler. What do you do at that point? what option is there? There's effectively two options, right? You can use some of the draft picks that you have to kind of absorb salary, specifically from teams that may be a little bit needy of it. Portland, for instance, is shockingly close, to the tax and apron for a team that is not very good at all. So, do you bring in a Jeremy Grant? Do you bring in a Malcolm Brogdon for draft compensation in that case? Or do you not give up the compensation, keep that, and do you instead just sign guys to, again, these balloon deals? I mean, that's a possibility that you could see. And again, Bruce Brown is a name that you can even talk about when you're talking about salary absorption. But like that's at that point the only option that you have left, because you're not just going to not sign guys. Like if you have money and you strike out, you're not just going to say, oh, well, we tried. Buddy Hield, here's $60 million. Like that's not how this works effectively, right? So it's going to come down to, if they do strike out on every single possible option, that they are either going to be looking to absorb guys in salary via trade, or they're going to be looking to sign guys. And the best way to do that is by paying more than anybody else. So from that perspective, it could easily be phrased that they're trying to prep the fans for that eventuality, at least just so they can, if for no other reason, act as if it has been part of the plan the entire time, even if it is option H, for instance. So it's not the brightest eventuality, not the brightest reality, but it very well may be the Sixers reality. We'll see. Still a lot of off-season to go. Thank you so much to everyone who listened to today's episode. Obviously, we had a longer one, but a lot of good meat. Thanks to some great reporting by Jake Fischer, by Brian Windhorst, and by Keith Pompey. And guys, just thank you so much for supporting the pod. We greatly appreciate it. I've been Zach Chavalella here with Sam DiGiovanni and Justin Crosby. Stay tuned for the next episode of Still Processing, a 76ers podcast.